Hopefully what we'll do for you is fire off a few rounds from the muskets, but before we do that, I'll quickly talk a bit about uniforms, because you'll notice each one of us is wearing something, at least theoretically, a little bit different, and that's because we represent different soldiers you can find here. First and foremost, then, we have our clear majority. That's me and Dalton over there at the end, representing British redcoats. Now, the British Army came in many shapes and sizes, usually in red like this, as you might expect, but the British Empire also brought in about 40 times the tax revenue of the United States, so they spent that on decoration for their clothing. That means that the cuffs, the collar, the taping, and buttons all over this uniform would let you know what regiment we were a part of. In my case, that means I'm a member of the 89th Regiment of Foot. This is a regiment from Ireland, raised around 1790, who by this point had the nickname Blaney's Bloodhounds, both after the name of their colonel, Colonel Blaney, as well as some of their early actions suppressing rebels in Ireland in the 1790s. So a rather auspicious reputation, and they also found heavy fighting here in Ontario, Upper Canada at the time, particularly at the Battle of Lundy's Lane on the 25th of July, 1814, where they took such horrible casualties that only one of their 10 companies was able to follow the army down here in the aftermath of the battle. The other guy on the end is representing a member of the Régiment de Watteville. That's a French name for a British Army regiment, so you might think that there's a particular story behind it, and there is. The de Watteville Regiment, or de Watteville Swiss, as the English called them, were a Swiss mercenary regiment that had become part of the British Army about 10 years before the war. That also meant, though, that they had not been back to Switzerland for a very long time, as it was surrounded by France and its allies. So instead, they were recruiting from émigrés, from foreign migrants and refugees coming to Britain during the wars in Europe, or from around where they were campaigning. That meant that there were a whole host of different languages spoken in the regiment. French and German were the primary ones, but you also found Polish, Hungarian, Turkish, Arabic, Italian, and Spanish being spoken amongst the ranks. So very polyglot. There also were a lot of them, about 1,200 here during the siege, the largest regiment the British had access to, and so it's unsurprising that they were the ones selected to assault Snake Hill on the night of August 15th, and the ones that didn't have the flints in their muskets when they went into action. So they paid for that, but assaulted 5 separate times over the course of the evening. So they proved their mettle, despite some of their English officers distrusting them because they weren't English. Finally, though, here in the middle, we have our lone antagonist on the field. That's Ethan, representing a member of the U.S. Army. Now, the U.S. Army itself was a comparatively new organization, and their uniforms were also a lot more simple than their British compatriots. He has very plain white taping there, and that's the uniform that most American soldiers would have been wearing around 1812 at the start of the war. By 1814, though, much of that had disappeared because the U.S. government had declared war on the British government, their primary trading partner and the world's premier naval power. So getting the money they needed to make those uniforms becomes very, very difficult. By 1814, in fact, most of the uniforms don't even have the red on the cuffs and collars, and 4 whole regiments that were here during the siege of Fort Erie didn't even get blue coats in time for the campaign. Instead, what they wore were their plain gray wool work jackets. These are undecorated jackets that are meant for manual labor. So think chopping down trees or digging latrines for the camp. Not soldiering, fighting, and parading, but despite that lack of proper uniforms, the gray coats and their blue-coated counterparts did things here that the U.S. Army had struggled to do for years at this point. Namely, they stood up against veteran British redcoats on open ground with equal numbers at the Battle of Chippewa, and they beat them outright in such a decisive victory that it is still remembered at West Point Military Academy today. You might notice they wear gray instead of the traditional American blue, and one of the reasons given for that change were the gray coats who fought alongside the blue here in 1814. But when you take a look at all the uniforms, the final thing you probably notice is just how bright and colorful they are. And you might wonder who in their right mind wears a gaudy suit of a bright coat, a tall, shiny, goofy-looking hat, and a shoot-me-here X in the middle of their chest onto an open field while they're getting shot at. It seems dangerous, and it was, but there was a good reason for it, and it mainly comes back to the weapons and what we'll show for you here. What they'll give you a closer look at are two different firearms. Our American has the Springfield 1795 standard issue for U.S. infantry, and both me and Dalton in the red have the British Brown Bess. Now, these weapons are quite simple, and despite the differences in name and appearance, they work the same. That dish on the side they're showing you right now is where you would pour priming powder to start loading the gun. You then close that up with the frizzen, you put everything else down the barrel from the front, and then pull back the hammer. The hammer contains a flint stone. When you pull the trigger, that'll shoot it forward into the frizzen, scraping off some metal and creating sparks. Those sparks should then land in the pan, which should ignite the priming charge, which should ignite the main charge, which will then send your round downfield, potentially into an opponent. Now, that might seem like a lot of shoulds, a lot of potentialities, and that's because it is. These weapons do have some issues. First and foremost, they're not very reliable. Even on a clear, calm, dry day like we have now, which are unfortunately perfect conditions for using a weapon like this, you could find statistically a 1 in 5 misfire rate when you're using them. If they get wet or they're not properly cleaned, this could very quickly become a better club than a firearm, because soaked, neither the flint nor the powder are going to produce any combustion. The other problem you come across is accuracy. Most weapons you'll find today have rifled barrels. The inside of that barrel has twisting grooves that spin the bullet out at high velocity and allow it to tightly grip the barrel. These are not rifled. Rifling takes good amounts of money and labor to actually produce, meaning that a rifle at the time was about 5 times as expensive to manufacture as this, a smoothbore musket. The inside of the barrel is just as smooth as the outside, and that means that this thing is cheap, easy to use, and accurate up to maybe 70 yards if you're a good shot. That's not great compared to a rifled barrel, but there were ways to get around it, and you've probably seen in the movies that they can get around those issues by just having lots of people. You get a lot of people trained with these weapons, marching shoulder to shoulder in close formations on open ground and firing en masse. Everyone's dealing with the same problems, and mass firepower tends to give you solutions. That means that at 300 yards, if you have a few hundred muskets, you can probably still hit something with lethal force if you know what you're doing. So that's great. But unfortunately, it brings up another problem, and that brings us back to the bright, gaudy uniforms, all of the smoke these weapons produce. Black powder creates about 20 times its volume in a thick gray smoke. It's a lot of waste material, and you'll see just how much smoke is produced by 2 weapons firing about 60 to 80 grains each. You might then imagine if you had 1,000 of these weapons on a hot and humid day, it might take half an hour before the first time you can readily identify your target is a few dozen paces away. That's not very good. So identifying yourself quickly was very important. So just like with sports teams, you want the audience to know who they're looking at any given moment. Red, blue, and other bright colors and clear decoration tells you who you're supposed to shoot, who you're not supposed to shoot. And hopefully that means that your friends will not try to shoot you, which is the least you could hope for. With that, though, we'll get our shooters over here to a safe distance, and we'll crack off a few shots for you. That's good right there. Whip, blank cartridge, prime end, load! That's the usual order, telling them to load at their own time. Taking out a paper cartridge filled with gunpowder, they will bite off the top and pour a little bit of that powder into the side dish to prime the gun. They'll then close it back up, put the rest of the charge down the barrel, and then very importantly, use a ramrod, a thin piece of metal that will force everything to the bottom of the barrel. Now, you could get away without using this. As I mentioned, the bullet in these is smaller than the barrel, so conceptually you could drop it down and it should get there. But unfortunately, with black powder, past all that smoke, there's another waste material it creates called fouling. Fouling is a thick, tarry substance that will gunk up the inside of the barrel very quickly. After 30 or 40 shots, you will need that ramrod to properly load the weapon, and that's a bit of an issue if you don't use the ramrod. Unfortunately as well, you're only given one, so you want to make sure to put it back after you've used it, because going across the field to get it back would be rather embarrassing. All right, with that then, folks, I will let you know that these weapons, are using real black powder. They will make quite a noise, so plugging up your ears isn't a bad idea. But if you want a shot with a camera, the best time to hit your trigger should be when I yell fire, as that's when they will be pulling theirs. And if you miss the first shot, fingers crossed, we'll have a second shot for you as well. All right, here we go. Present! Fire! Get it working! And there we can see the problems associated with the weapons. They don't always work, even in best conditions. Now, that can be for a few different reasons. It could sometimes be the flint itself. It is a piece of stone that gradually breaks apart as you use it, but more commonly, it's actually the powder. The powder itself is not always going to catch those sparks coming off of the flint prison. It's a bit of a probability game that you're playing there, and it also means in windy conditions that you might not actually get the sparks landing in the pan at all. So it doesn't take all that much to make these weapons quite unfeasible as firearms. Now, the ways to solve that are pretty simple and straightforward, which is very good because on the field you don't have a lot of time or often presence of mind to think through the problems with the weapon. You just want to get it working as quickly as possible. With that though, fingers crossed, we'll get them shooting. Preset! Fire! Prime and load! Get it working. And there we had one weapon going off. You can see just how much smoke was produced by that weapon. That, as I said, is maybe 80 grains of powder. That's not a heck of a lot at all. You might also notice, though, that they are doing all of this standing up. That's not just for your benefit, it's also how you normally did it back then, which might seem weird. They're on open ground. Someone's shooting back at them. Why not get closer to the ground or get behind something that you can fire from that could stop a bullet? Well, you certainly were trained to do that. We would know how to load lying down and kneeling down in case we needed to, but there's a bit of a problem. These are big, cumbersome weapons, and that cumbersomeness means that the closer you get to the ground, you still have to move it around, but you have less room to do it in. That slows you. And in these mass firepower demonstrations on open ground, the two things you really want are to fire lots of lead as quickly as possible and to be able to move quickly when you need to. And lying down basically makes both of those things impossible. Because of that, they had strict prescriptions against ducking or diving under gunfire. You were expected to stand stock straight and to make sure you were always in a ready position to act, even if you were taking gunfire. So that took a lot of training and a lot of peer pressure to actually work, but it was something that they would have gotten quite used to. With that then, fingers crossed, we'll have a second one. Preset! Fire! Spring rammers! Get it working. And there we can see the guns like to take turns here and there. The guns themselves are prima donnas after a fashion, and they like to get a little bit of time on stage themselves, and we don't like to begrudge them. They are a central part of our program. Now, as you've been seeing as well, they've been doing a few different things to try and alleviate the issue with Musket. Playing around with the powder is primary because they do have a tendency, especially that brown vest there, which is actually mine, it has a tendency to drop the priming charge when you're loading it. So you always have to be careful, but you'll also have seen Ethan there using a metal tool to hit his flint. As I said, the flint will gradually fall apart as you use it, and napping it, which is to hit the edge of it with a metal tool to create a jagged edge that will scrape sparks, is a pretty usual part of maintenance. However, as the saying would have you believe, don't get caught napping when you're out on the field. If you are caught in such a position, it's pretty clear to see from 50 yards away that you can't actually use the weapon. And if you're on your own or lightly attended by your friends, that makes you an easy target. So again, those big formations gave you a lot of protection. With that though, fingers crossed, we'll get him going. Reset! Fire! Spring rammers! Yes, the weapons just want their own shot. So round of applause for our shooters. They've done a wonderful job.